Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to record some thoughts about this book by Raoul Eshelman. It's called Performatism, or the End of Postmodernism. Yesterday, we met with my little Patreon reading group and we talked about the first chapter of the book. And because there's already so much in it, I don't want to wait until I finish reading the book. I just want to record some of my reflections here. And before I begin, I should acknowledge Greg Dember, whose article, he wrote an article in the Sideview journal and introduced the idea of metamodernism. And in that article, I read for the first time about Eshelman's book, Performatism. So let's go through some of the basics according to my understanding. What is performatism? Performatism is a style of creating and a style of interpreting. So both as a first-person standpoint and as a third-person standpoint. And I'm using here creating in a very broad sense. I'm treating life and the art of living also in that broad category of creating. So performatism could be an approach to life, an approach to the way we treat life as an art form, the art of living. And then from a third-person standpoint, we can interpret and make sense of that life, that lifestyle, that form of life. Interpret it, make sense of it. So it is both a style of creating and a style of interpreting. It is also, according to Eshelman, an epoch, a time in history where or when that style of creating and interpreting has become prevalent. If you read this book, like me, you might wonder, why is there so much discussion of the arts, including arts in the popular culture, movies and popular books? And the answer is because in the arts, the human condition is represented or staged. The arts provide a domain or a field in which humans intuitively think and reflect and represent the human condition. So reflection on art, when we study the arts, we are studying how people intuitively relate to the human condition. So reflection on art is reflection on how we intuitively relate to the human condition. So many things tend to first happen in the arts, and then philosophically we catch up in thought, in our thinking. We reflect and we try to make explicit what is already implicit in arts. So we philosophically catch up with what is already happening, what has already happened in the arts. Another important point is that performatism is a response to postmodernism. But it's a response to postmodernism that doesn't deny postmodernism. It doesn't go back in time and say postmodernism is a mistake. Let's go back to the time before postmodernism. Let's go back to modernity or to the Middle Ages. So in what sense is performatism a response, a corrective to postmodernism? Let's reflect on the general attitude, postmodern attitude, when it comes to both artistic creativity and important life decisions and life commitments. In that attitude, according to that approach, there is an endless deferral of meaning, or in postmodern lingo, there's undecidability or difference or other related concepts. And to flesh out these attitudes, these concepts, let's talk about this example. Very simple example of a person who's feeling nostalgic for something that happened in their past. Let's say I'm feeling nostalgic about a relationship I had as a teenager, and I exchanged love letters with someone, with a fellow teenager. So I'm feeling nostalgia about love letters exchanged many years ago. So this can be analyzed. You can reflect on this through a postmodernist attitude. You can say that, yes, at the present moment, my attention and my memory are directed at they're pointing to an object, namely love letters. But love letters themselves point to something. They're not important for their own sake. The letters point to something else, and that is they represent their sign of intimate acts of communication. And these acts of communication, they all also point to other signs of relationship, being in a relationship with someone. And so where is the relationship? Relationship is just a constellation of signs. And all these signs point to each other, affirm each other. And there's no final solid object. There's no resting point. There's no final point of, terminal point where you reach something solid and you can point to it and you say, this is the relationship. This is the final object of nostalgia. And because we are dealing only with signs, we cannot get away from these signs. We cannot get away from interpretation, because a sign has to be interpreted. A sign is not a thing in itself. A sign requires interpretation, so its interpretation depends on the context of interpretation, or the frame, the interpretive frame. And that frame or the context in which we are interpreting determines the meaning of the sign. In other words, a work of art within a postmodern approach is open, and its openness is a characteristic of how we, within a postmodern approach, think about creativity and commitment and decisions. Another feature of the postmodern attitude is the switch that can happen in interpretation. One interpretation and its opposite can both be considered, and both can be seen as viable. So here, in this example, we can ask, is my nostalgia really about the memories, something that I desire to go back to and to have? Or is it about some use of those memories for another purpose? Am I using these memories? Am I using my nostalgia teleologically to justify my current unhappiness, for example? And here I was reminded by that short novel by Milan Kundera called Identity. In that novel, one of the central characters, named Chantal, has lost her child at the age of 5. Her child dies. And we have these two interpretations. On the one hand, she remembers that memory as a very devastating, very sad event. On the other hand, she reflects on the event as a turning point, something that triggers her divorce and ultimately her freedom. She achieves her freedom because of the death of her child. So on the one hand, it is a positive thing that happened to her, or it's teleologically was turned out to be a useful thing, a positive thing. But on the other hand, the opposite is also true, that it was an extremely sad and devastating event. Now, performative art tries to get out of those undecidabilities and trying to overcome the split between sign and interpretation. And Eshelman talks about the double framing approach to interpretation and to creation. So this is the double frames. There are two frames. There's a larger frame and there is a smaller frame. These are together double frame. Let's put labels on them. The outer frame is the world within which the work of art is interpreted, and the work of art is sensible. The work of art makes sense within that outer frame, within that world, or within that worldview. And then we have the inner frame, in which is a more concrete, more particular event or action or decision that is consistent with the outer frame, that is congruent, that is supporting it, that is sustaining it. And Eshelman talks about an originary event. So in a story, there is an originary event that represents the outer frame. And these two, the inner frame and the outer frame, they have a tautological relationship between them. They point to each other. There's nothing beyond them that they get their support from. They're not supported by anything beyond themselves. They maintain each other. There's a back and forth between them. One of the most interesting points in the discussion was the contrast between postmodernism and performatism, or postmodernism and metamodernism, is presented as parallel to the contrast between deism and theism. But this doesn't mean that performatism involves a belief in God that is creating meaning. It only means that the source of meaning is not the God of deism. It's not a God that is detached, that is outside, that is somewhere else, that beyond our reach, and we can never reach it, we can never take our meaning from it. The acts of creation begin immanently. It begins with the inner frame, begins with that originary action or originary event, while at the same time signifying a transcendence or outer frame. Imagine, for example, that somebody has written a story in which, according to the outer frame, prayers come true. If you pray, then your prayer is fulfilled. And within that story, there's a person who prays at a very critical point in the story, and their prayer comes true, and some important consequences come out of that. Of course, we don't have to hold that assumption to be correct outside of the story, but only within the story, we have to hold the assumption for the events in the story to make sense. That relationship between the outer frame and the inner frame are consistent, which is to say, the creation of the story is a genuine act of creation, is a creation of events that make sense, because accompanying the events of the story, there's an outer frame, there's a worldview that comes with the story. Now, I found these ideas to be related to several other works. There is the Genuine Pretending book that I might talk about at some point in the future. There's also a book called Cruel Theory, Sublime Practice by Glenn Wallace, and Francois Laruelle's Non-Philosophy, which involves a sense of freedom to work with available material and to find what kind of experiences, what kind of worldviews, what kind of creations are available. Okay, thank you very much. I think this is long enough. I will continue the discussion of this book at some future point.